Billionaire sees his name tattooed on a stranger's wrist in a train wreck, then learns the shocking truth. The shrill ring of the telephone sliced through the sterile quiet of Sebastian Knight's penthouse office. It was just passed on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October, the kind where the sky over Chicago was a pale, promising blue, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city. Sebastian, already dressed in a bespoke suit, was reviewing overnight freight reports from Night Rail, the transportation empire his grandfather had founded and which he had expanded exponentially. At 52, Sebastian Knight was the very picture of contained, power-sharp gray eyes that missed nothing, silver temples framing a face accustomed to command, and a bearing that spoke of inherited wealth meticulously compounded by relentless ambition. He picked up the private line, his voice calm, clipped. "Knight." The voice on the other end belonged to David Chun, his chief operating officer. It was strained, tight with control panic. "Sebastian, there's been an incident. Train 407, the Prairie Zephyr, westbound passenger service, derailed just outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa." Sebastian's blood ran cold. The Prairie Zephyr was one of their flagship routes. Casualties? Significant, I'm afraid. Reports are still coming in, chaotic. Emergency services are en route, but it's a rural area. Access is difficult. "My jet," Sebastian said instantly. "Have it ready in 30 minutes. Inform air traffic control. I want clearance immediately. David, coordinate with local authorities. Spare no expense. Get our disaster response team mobilized. I want hourly updates." "Already underway, Sebastian." He hung up, the silence in the office suddenly oppressive. He stood, walking to the window, looking out at the city waking below, but seeing only twisted metal and unimaginable suffering. Night Rail wasn't just a business to him. It was his legacy, his name. An accident like this wasn't just a corporate crisis. It felt like a personal failing, a stain on everything he represented. He was known for efficiency, for safety, for meticulous control. This was chaos unleashed. Within the hour, Sebastian was airborne, the luxury of his private jet a stark contrast to the grim reality unfolding on the ground. He spent the flight conferring with his team via satellite phone, his face a mask of intense focus, betraying none of the sickening dread churning within him. He was an only child, his parents long deceased. His father, a formidable but emotionally distant man, had drilled into him the paramount importance of responsibility, especially concerning the family name and business. His mother, softer but often lost in her own social world, had offered little buffer. Work had become Sebastian's family, the smooth running of Night Rail his primary source of validation. The jet touched down at a small regional airport near Cedar Rapids. A waiting helicopter flew him the remaining distance, the rhythmic thumping of the rotors a grim soundtrack. As they approached, the scene came into horrifying view. Passenger cars lay scattered like discarded toys, some accordioned, others overturned, smoke mingling with the dust kicked up by rescue workers. The scale of the devastation was staggering. On the ground, the air buzzed with the frantic energy of disaster response. Sirens wailed, emergency lights flashed, shouts echoed. Sebastian, instantly recognizable despite the grim setting, conferred briefly with the incident commander, a weary-looking state trooper. "Mr. Knight," the trooper acknowledged, his face grim. "It's bad. We're doing everything we can. What do you need from us?" Sebastian asked, his voice steady. "Resources, equipment, anything. Right now. Sir, just stay clear unless you're actively assisting. We appreciate you being here. Shows responsibility." Responsibility. The word echoed his father's teachings. But standing there, Amidst the wreckage bearing his company's logo, it fell hollow. He saw the faces of the rescue workers strained, determined. He saw blankets covering forms that would never move again. He needed to do something, anything, more than just stand by as the figurehead. He spotted a paramedic struggling to maneuver a stretcher through uneven terrain near an overturned carriage. Without a second thought, Sebastian strode over, his expensive suit jacket shed moments before. "Let me help." The paramedic, startled, nodded. Grabbed the front. Together, they carefully lifted the stretcher, carrying an elderly woman with a bloodied bandage around her head. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, filled with fear. Sebastian murmured words of reassurance, his usual corporate detachment replaced by raw human empathy. For the next hour, he worked alongside the first responders, carrying supplies, helping stabilize victims, offering quiet words of comfort where he could. The mud stained his trousers, sweat beaded on his brow. The metallic tang of blood hung heavy in the air. He felt a connection to the chaos, a grim immersion that somehow felt more honest than directing things from afar. It was near a particularly mangled car, designated for the search for survivors, that he saw him. A firefighter was carefully extricating a man pinned beneath a section of collapsed seating. The man was unconscious, his face pale and smeared with dirt and blood, perhaps in his late 40s. He wore simple clothes jeans, a flannel shirt ripped to the shoulder. As they eased him onto a backboard, his left arm flopped limply to the side. Sebastian knelt instinctively to help secure the straps. That's when he saw it. On the man's inner wrist, stark against the pale skin, was a tattoo. It wasn't elaborate, just simple block letters, slightly faded as if done years ago. "Sebastian, brother." Sebastian froze. His breath caught in his throat. He stared, his mind struggling to process the two words. Sebastian. His name. Brother. Impossible. He reread it, tracing the letters with his eyes, convinced he was mistaken, hallucinating from shock and exhaustion. But the tattoo was undeniably real. He looked at the man's face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any resemblance. There was none he could immediately discern, though the grime and injuries obscured much. Who was this man? Why did he bear this impossible message on his skin? "Sir, you okay?" One of the firefighters asked, noticing Sebastian's stillness. Sebastian shook his head, tried to clear it. "Yes, fine." Is he alive?" "Barely. Weak pulse. Head trauma. Possible internal injuries. We need to move him now." As they lifted the stretcher, Sebastian's eyes remained fixed on the tattoo, the two words burning into his memory. He felt a dizzying wave of confusion, disbelief, and a strange, unsettling flicker of something else, a buried question, a possibility so remote he'd never allowed himself to consciously consider it. He watched them carry the man towards the triage area, a nameless victim marked with Sebastian's own name and a relationship that couldn't exist. He was Sebastian Knight, only son of Arthur and Eleanor Knight. He had no siblings. He was certain of it. Yet the image of the tattoo remained stark and inexplicable. In the heart of the wreckage of his train, amidst the tragedy and chaos, Sebastian Knight had found a mystery that struck at the very core of his identity, a phantom limb of family reaching out from the ruins. The ground felt unsteady beneath his feet, and for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Sebastian had no idea what came next. The days following the derailment blurred into a grueling marathon of crisis management. Sebastian remained in Iowa for the first 48 hours, overseeing Night Rail's response, meeting with investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, addressing the swarm of media with carefully worded statements expressing profound regret and commitment to safety and visiting the makeshift family assistance center. He projected an image of calm authority, the responsible tycoon taking charge. But beneath the surface, his mind was a turbulent sea of conflicting thoughts. The image of the tattoo haunted him. Sebastian, brother. It intruded on meetings, surfaced in quiet moments, and flickered behind his eyes when he tried to sleep. He found himself scrutinizing his reflection, searching for similarities in the stranger's battered face he recalled. He dredged up faded memories of his father, Arthur Knight, a man defined by ambition and stern pronouncements, not warmth or confession. Had there been secrets Arthur had taken to his grave? Whispers Sebastian had dismissed as a child. His mother, Eleanor, had been a society figure, elegant but often preoccupied. Could she have known something? She had passed away 5 years ago, leaving Sebastian truly alone at the helm of his life and business. There was no one left to ask, no easy way to probe the sealed history of his parents' lives. Back in his Chicago headquarters, the pressure was immense. Lawyers debated liability. Engineers pored over track data and maintenance logs, and the PR team worked overtime to manage the narrative. Sebastian navigated it all with his usual efficiency, but his focus felt fractured. He delegated more than usual to David Chun and his trusted executive assistant, Eleanor Vance, a sharp, discreet woman in her late 50s who had been with him for over a decade. One afternoon, sitting in his office, the city spread beneath him like a map. He finally spoke the thought aloud, testing its weight in the air. "Eleanor," he began, turning from the window. "Yes, Mr. Knight." She looked up from her tablet, sensing the unusual tone in his voice. The derailment. There was a man I helped rescue. Unconscious. He was taken to Mercy Hospital in Cedar Rapids. Sebastian hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I need to know his condition and his name." Discreetly. Eleanor's expression remained neutral, though a flicker of curiosity crossed her eyes. She knew better than to pry unless invited. "Of course, Mr. Knight. Do you have any identifying information?" "Mid to late 40s, I'd estimate. Brown hair, though it was hard to tell. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He had a distinctive feature." Sebastian paused, the word tattoo feeling too intimate, too revealing. "I'll know the name if I hear it. Just find out who the unidentified male victims matching that general description are and their status." "I'll look into it immediately," Eleanor said, making a note. The waiting was agony. Sebastian tried to immerse himself in work, analyzing safety protocols, planning enhanced inspection regimes, drafting compensation proposals for the victims and their families. He felt a heavy weight of responsibility for the accident itself. The initial NTSB findings pointed towards a potential track flaw, something that fell squarely under Night Rail's purview. The guilt was immense, a constant pressure behind his ribs. But interwoven with that corporate burden was the personal enigma of the tattooed man. Was it a bizarre coincidence? Could Sebastian refer to someone else entirely, and brother be a term of camaraderie, perhaps for military service or fraternity? It seemed plausible, rational, yet the directness of it, the starkness of his name, it felt too specific. Could it be a cruel hoax? Someone trying to capitalize on the tragedy, to extort him? He was a billionaire. Such attempts weren't unheard of. But the man had been unconscious, near death. It seemed an unlikely scenario for an elaborate con. Then there was the third possibility, the one that made his stomach clench, that it was true, that his father, the pillar of rectitude, had fathered another child, kept hidden for decades. It would shatter the image Sebastian held of him, complicating his grief and respect. It would mean he wasn't alone in the way he'd always believed. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange, unacknowledged corner of his heart, oddly resonant. The profound loneliness he often felt, masked by success and activity. Could this be the missing piece? Eleanor returned a day later. "Mr. Knight," she said softly, closing the office door behind her. "Regarding the patient at Mercy Hospital, there were several unidentified males initially. Most have now been identified by family. There is one man, admitted in critical condition with severe head trauma and internal injuries, who remains unidentified. He matches the general description you gave." Sebastian leaned forward. His condition? Still critical, but doctors upgraded him to serious but stable this morning. He's remained unconscious or unresponsive since admission. They haven't been able to question him. No identification on him at all. None. No wallet. No phone found at the scene that could be definitively linked to him yet. They're referring to him as John Doe. John Doe. The anonymity felt wrong, erasing the potential significance of the name tattooed on his wrist. "Thank you, Eleanor," Sebastian said. "Keep me informed. Let me know immediately if his status changes or if anyone attempts to identify him." "Will do, Mr. Knight." Sebastian made another trip to Iowa a few days later, ostensibly to meet with local officials and insurers. His real purpose was to visit the hospital. He stood outside the door to the ICU, peering through the small window. John Doe lay amidst a web of tubes and monitors, his face still bruised and swollen, head bandaged. He looked frail, vulnerable. Sebastian watched his chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of the ventilator. He felt a confusing mix of emotions: pity for the man's suffering, frustration at the unanswered questions, and that persistent, illogical pull. He stayed only a few minutes, unseen by the nursing staff, before retreating, the image of the still figure and the memory of the tattoo burning ever brighter. He commissioned a private investigator, a former FBI agent known for utmost discretion, tasking him with a delicate assignment. Should the John Doe be identified, the investigator was to conduct a thorough, confidential background check. Sebastian provided only the description and the hospital location, omitting the crucial detail of the tattoo. He needed facts, insulation from the raw emotion the mystery evoked. Days turned into a week, then two. Sebastian returned to Chicago, consumed by the dual pressures of the NTSB investigation and the silent waiting game regarding John Doe. He found himself looking at old family photographs, his father stern and imposing, his mother smiling vaguely. Were there clues hidden in their expressions, in the background of their lives? He saw only the familiar images of his solitary childhood. Then, one rainy afternoon, Eleanor entered his office, her expression urgent. "Mr. Knight," she said, holding out a printout. "Mercy Hospital just called. John Doe regained consciousness briefly this morning." He spoke his name. Sebastian's heart hammered against his ribs. He took the paper, his hand surprisingly steady. "His name is Mark," Eleanor continued softly. "Mark Johnson. He's still very weak, confused, but he was able to state his name and approximate age 47. No next of kin listed, no address yet. Mark Johnson, a common enough name. It told him nothing, yet everything had changed. The anonymous victim now had an identity. The mystery had a name. Sebastian looked at Eleanor. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow. I'm flying back to Cedar Rapids." The weight of uncertainty hadn't lifted, but it had shifted. Now it was mingled with a terrifying, burgeoning possibility. He was going back not just as the head of Night Rail, but as Sebastian Knight, a man potentially on the verge of discovering a truth that could rewrite his entire existence. The sterile quiet of the hospital room was broken only by the soft, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Mark Johnson lay propped up slightly by pillows, his eyes open but clouded with pain and disorientation. The heavy bandages were gone from his head, revealing stitched lacerations and lingering bruises. He looked thinner, the ordeal having stripped away any spare flesh, leaving his features sharp and weary. Sebastian stood in the doorway for a moment, observing. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, wanting to appear less intimidating than his usual corporate armor. He had spoken briefly with Dr. Ramirez, Mark's attending physician, who confirmed Mark was stable, lucid for short periods, but still weak and suffering from memory gaps related to the accident itself. He knocked softly on the doorframe. Mark's eyes turned towards him, slowly focusing. There was no recognition in them, only a guarded curiosity mixed with the weariness of pain. "Mr. Johnson?" Sebastian said gently, stepping into the room. "My name is Sebastian Knight. I was at the scene of the derailment. I wanted to see how you were doing." It was a partial truth, the easiest place to start. Mark blinked slowly. Knight, the name registered, but seemingly only in the context of the railroad. To the train, his voice was raspy weak. "Yes, Knight Rail. I'm the head of the company," Sebastian confirmed, pulling a visitor's chair closer to the bed. "I want to express how deeply sorry I am for what happened, for what you've been through." Mark just stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Was bad." "Yes," Sebastian agreed quietly. "It was." An awkward silence fell. Sebastian searched for the right words, his usual fluency failing him. How did one approach such a potentially life-altering subject? "The hospital staff mentioned you were unidentified for a while," Sebastian began tentatively. "They didn't find any ID on you." Mark frowned, a flicker of anxiety crossing his face. He glanced down at his arms, as if checking for something. "My wallet. Must have lost it." "We'll help with replacing anything lost, of course," Sebastian said quickly. "But, Mark, there is something else. Something on your wrist." Mark's gaze followed Sebastian's subtle nod towards his left arm. He slowly, painfully lifted his hand, turning his wrist over. The tattoo was still there, stark against his pale skin. SBSD wrote EHER. His eyes widened slightly as he looked at it, then slowly lifted his gaze back to Sebastian's face. This time, there was a dawning awareness, a mixture of confusion and something else, fear, resignation. "You saw it," Mark stated, his voice barely a whisper. Sebastian nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes, Sebastian is my name." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "What?" Mark looked away, staring at the blank wall opposite his bed. His breathing grew a little faster. He seemed to be gathering himself, wrestling with a decision. Minutes stretched, measured by the beeping monitor. Sebastian waited, forcing himself to remain patient, sensing the fragility of the moment. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice low and thick with emotion. "My mother. She told me. Before she died. 5 years ago." Sebastian leaned forward, straining to hear every word. "She had me young," Mark continued, his eyes still fixed on the wall. "Never married. Never told me much about my father. Just that he was ambitious. Already had a family. Didn't want another complication." Sebastian felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. His father. Ambitious. Already had a family. She said she met him when she was working as a waitress in Omaha. A whirlwind thing. He was older, successful, passing through town on business. Railroad business. Mark's voice cracked slightly. She fell for him hard. Got pregnant. When she told him, he gave her money. Told her to take care of it. That he couldn't be involved. He had a wife, a son, a reputation to protect. Sebastian felt like the air had been punched from his lungs. A wife, a son, him, my mom. She couldn't go through with ending it, Mark whispered. She moved away, raised me on her own. Worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. It wasn't easy. We moved around a lot. He finally turned his head, meeting Sebastian's gaze. His eyes were filled with a lifetime of quiet sorrow. She told me his name just before she passed, Arthur Knight, and she told me about his son, Sebastian. Sebastian sat frozen, the name confirming his deepest fear, his impossible suspicion. Arthur Knight, his father. She made me promise not to cause trouble, Mark said, his voice trembling now. She didn't want to hurt anyone. She just wanted me to know who I came from. He looked down at his wrist again. I got the tattoo after she died. Not to use it or anything. Just to remember, to feel like there was someone else out there. A connection, even if he never knew. Tears welled in Mark's eyes and tracked paths through the grime, still faintly marking his cheeks. I never imagined I'd actually meet you. Especially not like this. The room fell silent again, but this time it was heavy with the weight of revealed truth. Sebastian stared at Mark, seeing not just a stranger, but the echo of his own father in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes obscured by bruising. He saw the decades of hardship Mark had endured, the solitary life mirroring his own, but stripped of the privilege and wealth that had insulated Sebastian. The corporate veil, the carefully constructed facade Sebastian presented to the world, crumbled. The guilt over the train wreck, profound as it was suddenly overshadowed by a deeper, more personal wave of emotion. Guilt for his father's callousness. Regret for the years Mark had suffered alone, unknown, unacknowledged. A crushing sadness for the brother he never knew he had. Slowly, awkwardly, Sebastian reached out, his hand hovering over Mark's arm before settling gently near the tattoo. Mark flinched almost imperceptibly, then relaxed. Then, to his own surprise, Sebastian felt his composure break. Tears blurred his vision. He lowered his head, the polished veneer shattering completely. A sob escaped him, raw and unfamiliar. He knelt beside the hospital bed, his hands still resting near Mark's. Mark, he choked out, the name feeling both strange and deeply familiar on his tongue. I'm so sorry, so incredibly sorry, for my father, for everything you've been through, for all the years. He couldn't finish the sentence. The enormity of it, the abandoned child, the secret life, the chance encounter in the wreckage washed over him. He wasn't just Sebastian Knight, the railroad tycoon. He was Sebastian Knight, the son of Arthur Knight, and this man, this stranger bearing his name, was his brother. Mark watched him, tears streaming silently down his own face. He didn't pull away. He simply lay there, absorbing the shock, the shared grief, the impossible reality that the phantom connection he'd carried on his wrist had materialized in the flesh. Kneeling beside him, weeping for a past neither of them could change, but which now irrevocably bound them together. The sterile hospital room felt suddenly sacred, a space where two fractured lives had collided, and the painful process of piecing together a new, shared truth had begun. The emotional intensity of the revelation lingered in the sterile air long after Sebastian had regained some semblance of composure. He stayed with Mark for another hour, the conversation shifting from the momentous disclosure to quieter, more practical matters: Mark's injuries, his immediate needs, the daunting prospect of recovery. Sebastian spoke little about himself or his life, sensing Mark was too overwhelmed, too fragile. He simply listened, absorbing the fragmented details Mark offered about his life. A series of manual labor jobs, stints in construction, truck driving, never settling long in one place, always scraping by. No wife, no children. A solitary existence defined by hard work and the quiet burden of his mother's secret. Before leaving, Sebastian assured Mark that Night Rail would cover all his medical expenses and provide support during his recovery. It felt like the bare minimum, a grossly inadequate gesture given the circumstances, but it was a tangible starting point. "Get some rest, Mark," Sebastian said, rising to leave. "I'll be back." Mark just nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and emotion, watching Sebastian go with an unreadable expression. Back in the rarefied air of his private jet, Sebastian felt profoundly shaken. The confirmation of Mark's story, delivered with such raw vulnerability, had hit him with the force of a physical blow. Yet, a part of his mind, the pragmatic, cautious part honed by years of high-stakes business, insisted on certainty. Emotion was powerful, but facts were necessary. Upon returning to Chicago, he contacted the private investigator, Mr. Davies, again. "Davies," he said, his voice low and confidential. "The John Doe at Mercy Hospital, Cedar Rapids, his name is Mark Johnson, age 47. I need you to conduct an exhaustive, completely confidential background check. Everything. Birth records, mother's history, her name was likely Sarah Johnson, perhaps lived in Omaha around 48 years ago, worked as a waitress. Look for employment records, residences, any connection, however tenuous, to my father, Arthur Knight, particularly around that time frame." He hesitated, then added, the words feeling clinical despite their significance, "and Davies. I need you to discreetly arrange for DNA comparison. The hospital will have samples from Mr. Johnson. My own sample will be provided. Utmost discretion is paramount. No one can know the reason for this." "Understood, Mr. Knight," Davies replied, his professional calm a stark contrast to Sebastian's inner turmoil. "It will take some time, especially tracing records that old." "Take the time you need," Sebastian said. "Just be thorough, and keep me informed." The following weeks were a strange duality. Publicly, Sebastian continued managing the fallout from the derailment. The NTSB investigation progressed, confirming a section of track weakened by undetected internal corrosion was the likely cause. Night Rail faced intense scrutiny, lawsuits mounted, and Sebastian announced sweeping reforms to their inspection protocols and a substantial fund for the victims. He worked relentlessly, finding a grim solace in the familiar demands of his business empire. Privately, his life revolved around the hospital in Iowa and the man recovering there. He flew down every few days, shedding his corporate identity as the jet descended, becoming simply Sebastian, visiting Mark. Their interactions were initially awkward. The vast chasm between their lives was palpable. Sebastian, accustomed to controlling boardrooms and influencing markets, found himself unsure how to navigate simple conversation. Mark, intimidated by Sebastian's wealth and presence, was often quiet, hesitant, perhaps still grappling with the reality of their connection. They started small. Sebastian brought books and magazines. They talked about the news, about sports. Mark was a lifelong baseball fan, following the Cubs despite his transient life. Sebastian, who usually only followed markets, found himself looking up scores, learning players' names, finding a neutral territory where they could connect without the heavy weight of their shared past pressing down. Gradually, the conversations deepened. Mark spoke more about his mother, painting a picture of a resilient, loving woman who had shielded him as best she could. He spoke of the loneliness, the constant feeling of being an outsider, the yearning for roots he'd never had. He never expressed bitterness towards Arthur Knight, only a kind of bewildered sadness. He seemed less interested in Sebastian's wealth than in the simple fact of his existence. Sebastian, in turn, found himself sharing things he rarely spoke of, snippets about his own lonely childhood in cavernous houses, The immense pressure from his father, his complicated relationship with a man who demanded perfection but offered little warmth. He realized, with a jolt, that he was confiding in Mark in ways he never had with anyone else. In sharing the shadow their father cast over both their lives, albeit in vastly different ways, they found a fragile common ground. He learned Mark had a wry sense of humor hidden beneath his quiet exterior, a keen observational skill, and a fundamental decency that shone through despite his hardships. He saw the intelligence in Mark's eyes, the potential unrealized due to lack of opportunity. Sebastian started looking at Mark not just as a long-lost brother, but as a person, an individual he was beginning to know and even like. One afternoon, Mark asked hesitantly, "That tattoo, does it bother you?" "Me having it?" Sebastian considered it honestly. "It shocked me," he admitted, "but no, it doesn't bother me. I think," he added slowly, "I understand why you did it." A look of relief washed over Mark's face. The hospital staff grew accustomed to Sebastian's visits. Dr. Ramirez updated him regularly on Mark's physical recovery. The internal injuries were healing well, the head trauma symptoms receding, though physiotherapy would be needed. They also noted Mark's improved spirits since Sebastian's visits began. Then, one crisp November morning, Sebastian received a call from Davies. "Mr. Knight." The investigator's voice was calm, professional. The background check confirmed significant details. Sarah Johnson did work as a waitress in Omaha 48 years ago. Records show Arthur Knight stayed at a hotel there during that period for a railroad convention. Tracing Sarah after that is difficult. She moved frequently. But the crucial piece, the DNA comparison results, came back this morning. Sebastian held his breath. "It's conclusive, Mr. Knight," Davies stated. "The probability of you and Mark Johnson sharing the same father is 99.999%. You are half-brothers." Sebastian closed his eyes, letting out a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The confirmation wasn't a shock emotionally. He had already accepted it. But the scientific certainty anchored the reality, dispelling any lingering wisps of doubt. It was true, undeniably, unequivocally true. He thanked Davies, his voice steady despite the tremor running through him. The investigation was complete. The uncertainty was over. Now came the next, perhaps even more daunting, step: what to do with this life-altering truth. He thought of Mark, lying in a hospital bed, still recovering, still tentative. He thought of his own vast, empty mansion in Chicago. The path forward was suddenly clear, not easy, but necessary. It was time to bridge the chasm, time to truly acknowledge the bond sealed by blood and circumstance. Armed with the DNA confirmation, Sebastian flew back to Cedar Rapids the next day. He felt a strange mix of resolve and trepidation. Knowing the truth was one thing. Fully embracing its implications was another. Mark was out of bed, sitting in a chair by the window, looking stronger than Sebastian had seen him yet. He was gazing out at the bleak November landscape, a physical therapy schedule resting on the small table beside him. He looked up as Sebastian entered, a small, tentative smile touching his lips. "Sebastian," he greeted him, the name sounding more natural now. Sebastian returned the smile, pulling up a chair. He didn't preamble. He looked Mark directly in the eye. "Mark, I had some things checked out. Your mother's history. Birth records are difficult that far back, but the timing, the location, it aligns." And he paused, taking a breath. "I had a DNA comparison done." Discreetly. Mark's eyes widened slightly, his expression becoming guarded. He braced himself, perhaps expecting rejection, disbelief. "It's confirmed, Mark," Sebastian said softly but firmly. "We share the same father." We are brothers." The tension in Mark's shoulders visibly eased. He let out a shaky breath, a complex mix of relief, validation, and lingering disbelief washing over his face. He didn't speak, just nodded slowly, absorbing the finality of it. Sebastian leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Mark, I know my previous apology was inadequate. It was in shock. Now, knowing for certain, I need to say it again. I am profoundly sorry for what our father did, for the hardship you and your mother endured, for the fact that you grew up alone, without the support, the opportunities, without the family you deserved. It was a terrible injustice, and while I can't change the past, I want to try and make amends for the future." Tears welled in Mark's eyes again, but this time they seemed less about sorrow and more about release. "You didn't do anything, Sebastian," he whispered. "It wasn't your fault." "Maybe not directly," Sebastian conceded, "but I benefited from the life he chose, while you suffered from the life he denied. That makes it my responsibility now." "Our responsibility." He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Mark, when you're discharged from the hospital, I want you to come live with me. In Chicago. My house is large. Too large for one person." He saw the shock on Mark's face and quickly added, "Not as charity. As family. As brothers starting to figure things out. You need time to fully recover, to decide what you want to do next. You can do that there. With me." Mark stared at him, speechless. The offer was overwhelming, beyond anything he could have imagined. Chicago? Living with a billionaire? His brother? It felt like stepping into another dimension. I don't know, Sebastian," he stammered. That's too much. Your world. It's not my world. I wouldn't fit in." "We'll make it fit," Sebastian insisted gently. "It won't be perfect. It will probably be awkward as hell sometimes. We're practically strangers in many ways, but we're also brothers. Doesn't that count for something? Don't we owe it to ourselves, maybe even to your mother's memory, to try?" Mark looked down at his hands, then back at Sebastian's earnest face. He saw sincerity there, a genuine desire to connect, to atone. He thought of his small, empty apartment back in whatever town he'd last called home, the prospect of returning to grueling physical labor after his recovery, the ingrained loneliness. And then he thought of this man, his brother, offering him a lifeline, a chance at something entirely new. Slowly, hesitantly, Mark nodded. "Okay, Sebastian," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, we try." The transition was, as Sebastian had predicted, awkward. Mark was discharged a few weeks later, weak but mobile. Sebastian flew him back to Chicago on the private jet, an experience that left Mark wide-eyed and silent. Sebastian's mansion, a sprawling graystone edifice filled with art and antiques, felt more like a museum than a home. Mark, accustomed to cramped apartments and roadside motels, seemed lost within its echoing halls, uncomfortable with the silent efficiency of the household staff. Sebastian, used to his solitary routines, found his space invaded, his schedule disrupted. There were moments of friction, differing habits, misunderstandings, the sheer weight of their different life experiences creating invisible walls. Mark felt like an imposter, overwhelmed by the casual luxury, while Sebastian sometimes struggled to bridge the gap, his attempts at connection occasionally clumsy or misjudged. But they persisted. They shared meals in the vast dining room, gradually moving to the less formal kitchen. Sebastian took Mark to Cubs games, discovering a shared, genuine enjoyment. Mark, with his practical skills, found satisfaction in helping Sebastian fix a perpetually problematic antique clock, a small task that somehow bridged the gap more effectively than grand gestures. Sebastian encouraged Mark to focus on his recovery, arranging the best physical therapists, As Mark grew stronger, they talked more about the future. Mark expressed a desire to perhaps work with his hands again, maybe in carpentry or restoration, something tangible. Sebastian, seeing Mark's quiet intelligence and integrity, began thinking about possibilities, perhaps funding training or even finding a role for him within the charitable foundation Night Rail had established after the accident, focusing on community rebuilding. They visited their father's grave together, standing side by side in the quiet cemetery, looking at the imposing marble headstone bearing the name Arthur Knight. They didn't speak much, but the shared silence, the acknowledgement of their complex, flawed progenitor, forged another link in their growing bond. Months passed. The initial awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a tentative comfort, the burgeoning rhythm of a shared life. Mark started a woodworking course, his enthusiasm palpable. Sebastian found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, sharing details of his day, seeking Mark's quiet, grounded perspective. His vast house felt a little less empty, his own life a little less solitary. The train wreck had been a tragedy, a catastrophic failure that had cost lives and devastated families. Sebastian would always carry the weight of that responsibility. But amidst the ruins, something unexpected had been salvaged. A secret buried for nearly half a century had surfaced, brought forth by a faded tattoo on a stranger's wrist. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still challenges, moments of disconnect, the long shadows of their disparate pasts. But looking across the breakfast table one sunny morning, seeing Mark reading the sports section, looking healthier and more at peace than Sebastian could have imagined months earlier, Sebastian felt a profound sense of gratitude. The wreck had brought two strangers together, bound by blood and circumstance. Through pain, uncertainty, and tentative steps toward understanding, they were slowly, deliberately turning themselves into brothers. In the ruins of what was, they were building something new, something fragile yet resilient, something called family. And for Sebastian Knight, the billionaire who thought he had everything and nothing, that felt like the greatest fortune of all,